Welcome to Sentence Structures, a fill-in-the-blank, no-frills approach. By now, you should realize that sentences in general all have the following things in common. They all have a capital letter at the beginning, punctuation at the end, at least one subject, which is who or what the sentence is about, the doer of the action, and at least one verb or verb phrase, could be action or linking. Altogether, it must express at least one complete thought. The ingredients of sentences. All sentences are created by clauses. A clause is just a group of words with a subject and a verb. There are two kinds of clauses. There's an independent clause, which can stand alone, and during this presentation it will be represented with a blue line. There are also dependent clauses. These cannot stand alone. They will be represented with a red line. Some textbooks refer to dependent clauses as subordinate clauses. But whatever you call them, dependent or subordinate, they begin with either a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. Now, at the end of this presentation will be word lists where you can see a list of subordinating conjunctions and relative pronouns. There's some more ingredients we need to know for our sentence structure unit. Independent clauses are sometimes joined together, and we're going to represent that area where they're joined together with a triangle. Inside this triangle, there will be three options for joining the clauses together. One option is to just use a semicolon. Another option is to use a comma and one of the coordinating conjunctions. Sometimes teachers refer to those as fanboys as a memory device. The third option is to use a semicolon with a conjunctive adverb followed by a comma. A typical example would be semicolon, however, comma. All of these ingredients will be put together to show the four different basic sentence structures: simple sentences, compound sentences, complex, and compound complex sentences. A simple sentence is the same thing as an independent clause. Since it has at least one subject, at least one verb, beginning capitalization, and ending punctuation, and expresses a complete thought, it can stand alone. A simple sentence is independent. You'll notice here that a simple sentence is going to be represented by the same solid blue line as an independent clause. Simple sentences are independent clauses. On this portion of the slide, you can see there are several different examples of the configuration of subjects and verbs. You can have a single subject and a single verb, a compound subject and a single verb, a single subject and a compound verb, or a compound subject and a compound verb. Take a few minutes to read through these examples. Once you have a simple sentence well in hand, a compound sentence is just two simple sentences put together. We have two independent clauses, and we're going to select one of the triangle options to put those two independent clauses together. On this side of the slide, you can see several examples using each of the three options. Make sure that you notice that each independent clause could be its own simple sentence because each contains a subject and a verb and a complete thought. Complex sentences are made up of an independent clause and at least one dependent clause. Now remember, dependent clauses begin with subordinating conjunctions or relative pronouns. Your textbook probably has lists of those, and there will be lists presented at the end of the presentation. There are several patterns for creating complex sentences, and punctuation is affected by each pattern. In pattern A, you'll have the independent clause first, followed by the dependent clause. In pattern B, you'll have the dependent clause first, followed by the independent clause. A lot of the times when that happens, the two clauses will be separated with a comma. Sometimes there's pattern C, where we begin an independent clause, we finish it at the end of the sentence, but in the meantime we've interrupted it with a dependent clause. Quite often in that pattern, the whole dependent clause will be set off by commas. Often, but not always. It's very important that you remember that all clauses, independent or dependent, have subjects and verbs. Take a few minutes and read through the three patterns on this side of the slide. The last sentence pattern that we have is called compound complex, and it is just what it sounds like. It's a compound sentence with at least one dependent clause added to it. Like complex sentences, there are several patterns. Only two are represented on this presentation, but there are more. As long as a sentence has a compound sentence with at least one, and maybe more, dependent clause somewhere in it, you have a compound complex sentence. Take a few minutes and look at the two examples given on this side of the slide. Presented on this page is a legend for use through the study of sentence structures using this method. Again, as review, independent clauses are represented with a blue line. The ways that we can join independent clauses when we're making compound sentences or compound complex sentences is represented with the yellow triangle. Again, there are three things that could go inside that yellow triangle: a plain semicolon, a comma and one of the coordinating conjunctions, or a semicolon, a conjunctive adverb followed by a comma. Dependent clauses are going to be illustrated using a red line, and each dependent clause is going to start with either a subordinate conjunction or a relative pronoun. Here's the word list that I've been talking about during the presentation. For use with compound sentences, in other words, things that might go inside the yellow triangle, here's a list of the common coordinating conjunctions, sometimes referred to as fanboys: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. And here's a brief list of conjunctive adverbs: accordingly, also, besides, consequently, finally, furthermore, hence, however, instead, nevertheless, otherwise, similarly, still, therefore, thus, as a result, in other words, in fact. And as these are comprised of adverbs, and there are many adverbs in the English language, this list can be quite long. For complex sentences, or when we're going to use a dependent clause, dependent clauses start with either subordinate conjunctions, and here's a brief list of those, or relative pronouns. If a relative pronoun is used to start a dependent clause, you should try to remember that sometimes it will act as the subject of the clause also. You may have noticed that some of the subordinate conjunctions can also be prepositions. If you start a dependent clause with a subordinate conjunction, but don't have a subject and a verb somewhere in there, there's a good chance that you've created nothing more than a prepositional phrase. So be on the lookout for that. Here's our sentence structure recap. Again, simple sentence, same thing as an independent clause. Compound sentence is nothing more than two simple sentences joined together by one of those three choices we talked about. Complex sentences come in different patterns, but they're all created by an independent clause and at least one dependent clause. Sentences can have more than one dependent clause and still be complex. Compound complex sentences are just what they sound like. It's a compound sentence with an element that also creates an area that is like a complex sentence.